Right. Well, it looks like most people have been able to trickle in an efficient manner. As Addison, who is running this event for us, reminds us in the chat, this is recorded, but your questions will be private and you can submit them through the Q&A function. Again, I'm Nan. I'm a fellow with the governance program at the R Street Institute, and I'm so glad that you could join us for this very, very important discussion. As our own Department of Defense said back in March when they presented Biden's FY24 budget, they said that China drives the FY24 budget request. So this is certainly a big deal, and there's been a lot of China news and relationship questions in the news lately. Questions about Cuba, about capabilities, and again, how much we should be investing in this threat. That's why we called this event Accounting for Risk. How should we really be calculating the risk this poses, and what impact should that have on our federal budget, which itself is in a rather dire state? I'm so thrilled to be joined today by Emma Ashford, Dan Brazier, and our own Brandon Pugh. And we will start with Emma for a 5-minute introduction, really helping to put this risk in perspective, and then I will introduce the others for their own 5-minute remarks before we get into questions and discussion. And I hope that you will feel free to offer a lot of your own very insightful questions. Emma Ashford is a senior fellow with the Reimagining U.S. Grand Strategy Program at the Stimson Center. She works on a wide variety of issues related to the future of U.S. foreign policy, international security, and the politics of global energy markets. While Emma talks, I will also be putting her full bio along with information and Twitter handles for everyone else in the chat. Please take it away, Emma, educate us.
Great. Well, thanks to Nan and the folks at R Street for setting this up. I'm going to preface my remarks here by saying that I am not a budget person. I don't really do budgets. I don't really understand what goes into it, but I do strategy. And at the foundation of strategy is prioritization. Understanding what are the biggest risks, what are the biggest threats, and then how do we prioritize the resources that we have to get to that. So I know my colleagues here on the panel will focus a little more on the budget side of things. I'm going to focus on the risk side of the equation, right? How do we understand what the genuine level of threat from China is? How do we understand how to prioritize that? And I think, for a lot of policymakers, for many of your bosses, for others in DC, we are in a relatively unusual historic moment, right? China is a rising power. It's a state that has the potential to be, as we in international relations would say, a hegemon, right? Which is just a big fancy word that means they might be able to dominate their region. They might be able to dominate Asia. And they're a state that has sort of the economic and potentially military clout to match the United States. This means that there is some risk in China's rise. We haven't faced a situation like this since the middle of the 20th century. So by the end of the Cold War in the 1980s, there were crises, but things tended to be relatively stable. The US and the USSR had some sense of each other's red lines, some sense of each other's priorities and the risk. But if you go back a little further towards the start of the Cold War, it was quite dangerous in many ways. And I think that is more analogous to the situation that we now find ourselves in, right? So we have a rising China. It has the potential to undermine US influence in Asia, make it more difficult for the US to operate militarily. It has the potential to impede our ability to trade and market access in Asia, but we do not yet know the extent to which China wants to do any of those things, or the extent to which this could become a larger competition or conflict with China. So this clearly cannot be ignored. It is clearly a risk that policymakers need to account for. But at the same time, we shouldn't let it get out of perspective here. America remains a remarkably secure nation, particularly as a nation that is a continent. We're well insulated from a lot of threats. We have a nuclear deterrent. And what this means, I think, is that China poses some risk, it poses some threat, but it is one that is manageable with smart strategy. So I guess the second thing I want to do here today is just point out that I think our policy response or our policy approach to China, the debates we're having in Washington over how to approach China in the last, let's say, 5 years, have swung from far too little to far too much. And policy responses require finesse and moderation. So what does US strategy need to do with regard to China? We need to deter China from military action in Asia. We need to maintain our access to diplomacy in Asia, to markets in Asia. We need to keep our access to the freer international community that we have come to enjoy. We need to make sure America has lots of flexibility, that we can work with friendly states or even not so friendly states if we want to. But at the same time, the policy responses in recent years have swung so far that I think we are risking moving towards open conflict with China. And I would put to you that I think the only thing that could genuinely destroy or undermine American security is a major war with China. We do not want to push that this far. And of course, as others will talk about, it's more challenging from a resource perspective. So obviously, in 5 minutes, I am not going to be able to tell you what our China strategy should be, but I'm going to leave you with, I think, 3 key points, and then I'm happy to talk more about them in the Q&A. And I think for me, these are the 3 pillars of how I would approach Asia-China strategy. The first is don't lean too heavily on Taiwan as the linchpin of our entire strategy in the region. I know it's where we often end up in these discussions, but Taiwan is a difficult case legally, in sovereignty terms, in cultural terms, in nationalistic terms. It's the one where the US is objectively the weakest. It shouldn't be the linchpin of our strategy. A second pillar of this strategy would be do not rely entirely on military options. I know that we talk about the defense budget, but plussing up diplomatic and economic engagement in Asia is a lot cheaper. It's what countries in the region want, and it's less likely to end up in a war with China. This, I think, is an area where resources could be fruitfully spent. And then the third is, just more generally, consider resource prioritization. This is a time when we see a new threat to consider where best to use our resources and consider where we're spending them now that may not be the best use of them. And so if folks want to talk a little more about things like burden sharing in Europe, I think that there are some very valid ideas out there for ways to make the defense budget stretch further while relying on reputable and reliable allies. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emma. You've given us a lot of things that we should consider. Next, I am so happy to introduce Dan Brazier. He is the Senior Defense Fellow at the Project on Government Oversight. He's a former Marine Corps captain who served tours of duty in Iraq and Afghanistan during the War on Terror. He is also an F-35 aficionado, and I read all of his work on that, but he is great at digging into the minutia of all the most annoying issues at DoD. And interestingly, last time we were talking about this complex relationship with China along with Emma. We were in the middle of a spy balloon fiasco. So that was great timing, but we're so glad to have Dan back to tell us a little bit more about the history of the China threat.
Sure. Well, thank you very much, Dan, for that introduction, and thanks for hosting this event. speaking of fighter planes, if I'm hearing some circling over over the house here right now. There's a big kind of gap terrain feature that the National Guard likes using for terrain flying, and today seems to be a day they're doing that. So if you hear that in the background, I apologize. So I kind of came into China work from an odd direction. So my background is very much defense policy. So weapon systems and budgets and structure and organization. And what I noticed over the last couple of years is that all of a sudden discussion of China just dramatically ramped up. And and before you know it, everything, like all defense policy decisions were framed in how they fit within the China framework. And so I kind of did, slowly figured out that for me to be effective and for me to properly explain things and put my work into context, I needed to get very smart about China and whether or not our policy, the policy decisions that were being made in Washington actually fit the situation on the ground. And you probably aren't going to be too terribly surprised that I don't think they do. And for a lot of reasons that Emma just talked about. I think that the single-minded fixation that a lot of people have on the Taiwan situation is a little misguided. I think that a lot of the conversations that are had in Washington, they're basically premised on one kind of central argument, which is that China poses a direct and imminent military threat to the United States, and the United States has to spend vast fortunes building a military to confront China. That is, you don't hear people articulate it quite that way, but when you boil their arguments down, that's what you end up with. And I tend to be a bit of a cynic, which means that I have to question all of those, and all of those kind of conventional wisdom type statements. And so in the case of China, I think there are a lot of questions that aren't being asked. When people make the assertion, which is true, that China now has the largest military or the largest navy in the world, that's very true. And that is used for justification for building, more nuclear submarines and nuclear powered aircraft carriers, and just making a whole bunch of big decisions about the kind of ships that we buy. But nobody seems to be really asking, well, what is the Chinese Navy meant to do, and how is the what are China's plans for employing their navy? When you look at that and you see that, yes, they have a lot of ships, but the ships that they're building are relatively small, and they are meant to operate underneath the defensive bubble that the Chinese have created with their anti-access area denial systems or network. And so maybe the decisions that are being made in the United States to build big aircraft carriers or an aircraft carrier centered fleet to attack directly into that Chinese defensive system might not be the best option, because attacking directly into the enemy's strength generally does not work out throughout military history. And so I think it's just important for us to properly evaluate the situation as it is, make realistic decisions that doesn't necessarily, that doesn't bankrupt the United States, and it doesn't escalate tensions to the point where just our mere preparations might precipitate a war that wouldn't really benefit anybody. So, because the last thing I think anybody needs is a big war between two major nuclear powers. So I'll leave it to there. Leave it at that, and I look forward to answering everyone's questions.
Thank you, Dan. Well, so far we've really kind of talked about traditional weapons, traditional relationships around the globe. But Brandon brings something altogether different and very timely to the table. Brandon is a policy director and resident senior fellow for the Cybersecurity and Emerging Threats team here at the R Street Institute. Outside of R Street, he serves as an international law officer in the U.S. Army Reserve, where he worked on the Army Cyber Institute's Critical Infrastructure Resiliency Project. He is also a board member for the Ithaca College Cybersecurity Program and for a Governor's Advisory Council. Brandon, tell us more about the non-traditional side of the China problem.
Yeah, Dan, thanks for coordinating this event. I truly mean it. It was fascinating for me to actually hear both Emma and Dan speak, because so oftentimes I just tend to focus on cyber, data privacy and security, and like these emerging tech issues as they relate to China. So it's always helpful to be brought back to a broader conversation. Before I even start, I know today's event is on China, but I just want to preface our remarks that especially in the cyber realm, we can't always just focus on China, because we see so much of Russia and North Korea acting in the cyberspace along with other countries. So I even see in DC policy circles, we just are hyper focused on the Chinese cyber threat. It's very real and exists, which I'm going to go over, but it is part of a broader cyber threat to the US. So let's just maybe go over some of the background on what we see China doing, where they want to go in terms of cyber security and national security, then talk about maybe what the Department of Defense can and should be doing in the cyberspace. And obviously I'll touch on AI, because you can't really have a conversation these days without either AI or TikTok coming up, or both. So we do know that like China has a history of cyber and hacking campaigns. This is at best just groups that are very aligned with the interests of the Communist Chinese Party, at worst directly and led by the Communist Chinese Party, or maybe a mixture of the two. I mean, the hacking side, one of the more prominent examples of what we saw was going back to the OPM breach in 2015, where millions of current and federal employees had their personal sensitive information released. Potentially some of us on this panel, if you held security clearances. And then even to this day, we see an ongoing quest to steal intellectual property. This is the way the Chinese government has gotten around the traditional expense and headaches and slow process of R&D. They can just steal it directly. And between the IP theft, counterfeit goods, as well as their pirated software, this is costing the US potentially $600 billion per year. Some statistics show it even higher. And we also know like they present a very real threat to our critical infrastructure. Some people may say this is just the wording of the assessment, but something I paid attention to was the annual threat assessment of the intelligence community. They said it's almost certainty that China would attack our critical infrastructure in the event of conflict. And we see threats like that on a daily basis. Maybe not to the extent where an electric grid is being taken offline, but they're definitely trying. But on the other side of this case, we also see a risk to our personal data privacy, as well as this data collection. This is something we've known they've been doing against their own citizens for years, but we also see it an ongoing campaign against Americans, specifically members of our military in the intelligence community. China's particular interest is around genetic and health data right now, but it also goes much broader than that. And this isn't just a hypothetical of how this could play out. We see Russia doing this in the Ukraine conflict, where they're collecting members of the Ukrainian military's personal information, either for disinformation or for physical violence. And I think something like that is very real in a US-China conflict. But where does China actually want to go? Well, we've seen some public statements recently that they want to be the artificial intelligence leader by 2030, if not before, and they directly tie that to national security and military goals. And it doesn't just stop with AI. And their quest is around autonomous vehicles, around other niche forms of technology like LiDAR. I'm happy to go into some of those. But I think Dan raised a few good points, as well as Emma, specifically on the cost and budget side. I don't want to put myself out there as an NDAA or a Pentagon budget expert, but I have no shortage of thoughts on it. It goes without saying, we have limited resources, and the default always seems to be let's spend more, let's increase our budget size. It's not saying there's not a time and place for spending in certain cases, but it does come down to priorities. And I think cyber puts this on full display. It requires coordination across the federal government. This isn't just something the Department of Defense needs to be worrying about, although they should. There's also a lot of low cost or free steps that should be taken in the short term, which we can go into. One of those is just looking at how do we better integrate our National Guard and Reserve forces. This has been something that the Armed Services Committee on both houses has been considering for a long time, but we've not seen a ton of progress in that direction. And it's also a matter of making sure we're investing in the right areas. To Dan's point, do we just build more ships, or should we be putting more into our nation's cybersecurity defense, as well as offensive capabilities, as well as just other forms of emerging technologies like AI? So maybe I'll stop there and leave room for questions. Happy to kind of delve into some of the key kind of points I was raising during my opening. Thanks again, Nan.
Thank you, Brandon. At this time, I hope that you guys will flood the Q&A tab with all kinds of really insightful questions. If not, you'll have to listen to mine. But also, I also welcome our panelists to raise questions or make any points that they would like to make at this time based on what their fellow panelists brought up. Chime in. If not, I'm going to go for it. Okay. Well, I think one of the things that we should address right away was something that the Wall Street Journal reported just yesterday, and that was that China would like to, or is in talks with Cuba to make a joint defense base. Is this something that we should be worried about, or to Brandon's point, should we be more concerned if they buy a lot of servers or something else? How should we evaluate it when we get what seems like troubling news?
I guess I'll just jump in first. So I am not massively concerned about the notion that China is cooperating with Cuba on espionage issues. This would not be new in any respect, right? The Cubans worked with the Soviet Union throughout the Cold War. We hardly trust them today. So this is not anything new that US intelligence services have to handle. Where I would be more concerned would be if this started to bleed into military cooperation. Just because Cuba is so close to the United States. And, again, this is something that's very difficult to handle, particularly given how poor the relationship between the US and the Cuban government is. But I think that there are ways to handle it, mostly involving building our own better relations with the Cubans. But for right now, where it seems it's just espionage, I'm less concerned.
Well, I'd point out too that beyond just the potential espionage aspects of it, turn the map around and look at it from the Chinese perspective. If you go back in history and you look at like the 1979 Chinese invasion of Vietnam, like a big part, like a big factor that precipitated that was the Chinese were worried about encirclement. Go back to that whole old saying that while we're playing chess, the other side's playing Go. Well, if you look at the situation that precipitated the 1979 war, it was the Chinese felt that they were being encircled on the Go board, and they were worried about Soviet influence in Cambodia and a larger Indochina confederation, basically, that was going to kind of choke off China. So I don't know, maybe this is a move for the Chinese just trying to get under our skin a little bit, trying to place Go pieces in our hemisphere, just to get inside our head a little bit and maybe make us provoke an overreaction. So I'm not terribly worried about it. I wouldn't it's kind of like a and I hate to reduce it to terms like this, but if you have small children making a bunch of noise and you overreact a little bit, you might actually be playing right into their hand. So I think it's important for us to maintain perspective and not overreact too much, because I don't think that this is exactly the first move of a giant Chinese invasion of South Florida via Cuba. So let's hope cooler heads prevail.
Yeah, I mean, I'll continue, but specifically from like a cyber lens, proximity can have a benefit in certain cyber incidents, but I am just as, if not more worried about what China can do and is doing in China itself. And the United States is trying to go after those bad actors. We see the Department of Justice, continue many prosecutions. Some of those actors were never going to get along, to actually get. I mean, the running joke is, and I can't take credit for this, is like, yeah, we can go after and prosecute people. We're getting convictions, but like, who cares? Like, are they just not going to come to Disney World then in Florida? Not saying we don't do it, but it has limited impact. But obviously, I'm all for aggressive prosecution in those cases. I would say that I can't confirm this, but open source reporting is showing that some Chinese tech companies have been involved with that facility that's in question in Cuba. And allegedly speaking, those telecom company employees have been going in and out of that facility. Not too dissimilar what we've seen them doing in other parts of the world. Granted, it's not as close to the US. China has been working very closely with countries in Africa for years. Matter of fact, some statistics show the majority of the IT infrastructure in certain countries actually is from or belongs to China. So it's just an ongoing quest where they want to have an IT and cybersecurity presence, or I should say cyber presence around the world.
I think everyone touched on this a little bit, but if we could dig deeper into what are China's broader goals here? What is the end game? What do they want? What do they want with all this data, and who's liking what videos, and this person, had the chickenpox vaccine, but at the same time, they're making islands, they're making little ships, and to Emma's point about broader relationships, they're very active in that. What is it that China is trying to achieve on the global stage?
Perhaps Brandon can start and then we can sort of zoom out.
Sure. Yeah. Dan, since you mentioned data security, data privacy, I'll never miss an opportunity to talk about that. I guess two answers. One is the broad answer, which may seem like I'm pining the question, but I truly mean it, is we don't know what their true intent is around this data collection. We do know they've been collecting so much information on Americans, our allies, and on their own citizens. And this is super sensitive information, from biometrics to health information to our daily shopping habits. Information can have a lot of benefit. Data specifically can have a lot of benefit in a military situation, like we see playing out in Ukraine right now. It's an easy way to get messages out. It's a way to make target messaging, and it's a way to target people for physical violence, in an event of conflict. It also fuels a lot of the technology that they are intent on being a world leader in. AI is not new technology. We like to think it is because of the generative AI and chatbots that have emerged, but the actual technology itself has been around for many years, and at its core, it relies on data. So having data and having a lot of it can produce benefits in other areas. So in terms of a messaging point of view, it is ironic because we know China is collecting all this information. They do have two laws, a national data privacy law, as well as a data security law, neither of which we have in the United States. So we could have a debate whether they're actually being followed or if it's more just on paper, but they do have them. So it is kind of putting themselves out there of trying to spread their ideology around the world as well.
Yeah, sure. So I guess I'll jump in next. I don't know the difference between TikTok and Instagram, so forgive me if I don't talk about digital things. I think at a very broad level, though, this question of what China wants, right, it's one that's animating, not just policymakers, but also China scholars, people who study this on a regular basis. And the answer is, unfortunately, we don't know. And this is kind of a classic international relations problem. Books and dissertations, everything have been written on this. We know that China is a rising state. We know that they're revisionist, right? They seek to reshape some aspects of the international system. We just don't know exactly which ones, and we don't know how far they want that to go. So this is why you will hear people say things like China just wants a slightly more equal international institution landscape, and then other people saying China intends to conquer Asia and displace the United States as the hegemon. We don't know. So strategy in that context has to be a balancing act, where you try to hedge against the risks of the worst case, but don't overreact if what China wants is actually less. And there are a lot of, as sort of Brandon alluded to in the information space, there are a lot of areas where it's very difficult to assess steps that China takes, whether those are really about military advantage or they're about economic advantage. I think the whole semiconductor debate we could get into fits in this category. But I don't want to downplay this. I know it sounds a little like I'm punting. This is just a difficult problem. And threading that needle is really the only way that you avoid the bad outcomes on either end.
And real quick, sorry, Dan, not that I don't want to jump in. Emma mentioned TikTok. I guess I'm happy to kind of expand on my thoughts around TikTok. But a quick notion, people are like, always ask me about it. At the end of the day, I don't want a lot of my super sensitive information going to the US government. And I have a lot more faith in the US government than I do in the Chinese government. So that's the last thing I want to do as a kid or a neighbor having their personal information going to the CCP for whatever malicious purpose it may have, or even giving the benefit of the doubt, which I don't believe. It's not for malicious purpose. It's just for a more competitive business benefit. I wouldn't want to help them in that regard either. So that's my maybe slightly cynical side.
Well, so I very much agree with Emma that it is generally difficult to understand exactly what the end state is that the Chinese leaders are looking for. I mean, I tend to take them at their word that by 2049 they want to be kind of like the leading global power. But my work kind of focuses on how they might achieve that. And what I don't see happening is the Chinese using military means to achieve those ends. If they want to supplant the United States, they can, they could potentially try doing it militarily. I don't think that would work out for anybody. I think the Chinese have at least as much to lose as we would in that kind of a conflict, if not more. But I could see the Chinese using their military buildup to try to knock down the United States. And a way that you can do that, and what I kind of see the Chinese doing, is by, well, we'll use a specific example. So the Chinese aircraft carrier program, that's been underway for about 2 decades, if not even more than that now. I think it was 1998 maybe when the Chinese bought the unfinished aircraft carrier from Ukraine, actually. And so they've been developing aircraft carriers now for about 25 years. They haven't actually gotten all that far. They have 3 aircraft carriers, one of which is kind of a copy of the Ford, but it hasn't actually worked yet. But they don't need a working aircraft carrier to provoke the United States into building even more of our own aircraft carriers. Like it's been cited as justification by U.S. Navy admirals. I think one of them actually said, this isn't exactly a direct quote, but when asked about the Chinese aircraft carrier, he said, "Hey, yeah, good on them. It just helps justify buying more aircraft carriers or the importance of the aircraft carrier." And I saw that and I thought, well, maybe that is the purpose of the Chinese aircraft carrier program. It's to provoke us into spending even more money, at a time when we're constantly debating the debt ceiling, the debt limits. That would be exactly the time if I was engaged in political warfare against the United States. That's exactly the moment that I would try provoking even more spending, more deficit spending on behalf of in the United States. So
like
I don't know. I think that might
Russia
be
had its new ice cutter.
exactly. Exactly. So I see those kind of things as more, political and economic warfare than, direct, physical military means. I think that's how the Chinese are going to, try to achieve their goals, whatever they might be.
Continuing in this vein, I know it's a little esoteric, but one thing I noticed in some meetings and conversations I had over the last week plus was, a lot of people saying, well, we have to win this fight, but is there actually a fight? And we have to win because otherwise we'll lose. But I wasn't clear on what we would lose, especially when relationships between countries are dynamic. And really, when we look at the spread of history, this is such a tiny blip, and things are changing all the time. And a lot of voters say we don't want to be the world's police. A lot of other voters say we kind of have to, and there's a lot more in between. What is it? Do we have something to lose? And what is it that we could be losing? What is the big concern here?
I mean, I think, not to put too fine a point on it, the biggest risk here is the risk of open conflict with China. And that doesn't necessarily have to be a conflict that goes nuclear for it to be disastrous. I actually would highly recommend an article written a few months back by my friend Stephen Wertheim at the Carnegie Endowment, who wrote a piece basically on what a world war with China would look like. And this is something that would be incredibly costly and deadly for thousands and thousands of Americans. So that's sort of that's the tail risk, right? So we shouldn't kid ourselves that that's not a concern. But there are other concerns, I think, that also bear keeping in mind. I mean, one is that we overstretch ourselves, that we sort of spend ourselves into a budgetary hole that we can't get out of, that we make a variety of commitments around the world that we can't actually sustain, which ends up making empty commitments that aren't particularly credible. We end up seeing, conflict or other problems as a result. So, I think the problems are real here. And I think mostly they are on the end of sort of overestimating the China threat rather than underestimating it. At least for me, at least now. I might have said something different 5 years ago.
You only have to chime in if you want on this one, but again, in a similar thread, we have an interesting question from a participant. Speaking of what China wants, if you are President Xi, who wants to control everything on Earth as to stabilize his position, what would you do instead of collecting all the information, IP, intelligence? What would you do if you were the emperor of all mankind, or in this case, to bring it back to what we're talking about, what are you thinking if you're President Xi Jinping? This is an easy question.
Well, I don't think he wants to be emperor of the entire world. I think he's finding out right now that he's having enough trouble, just being an emperor of, the traditional, Chinese, domain. Because we hear all the, all the stories of, about dealing with the Muslim Uyghurs and all those populations, and moving forward, China has some serious challenges moving forward, like internal challenges. There's a coming demographic crisis that might already be underway, and we just don't know about it. We haven't seen the full effects of that reported yet. There's also economic problems in China. There's a huge debt problem. With all the ghost cities is that you read about. Like, that's a problem for people's personal finances. There are a lot of Chinese, thousands and thousands of Chinese citizens who have taken out mortgages on on apartments that will likely never be finished. So they're paying rent on their current places, and they have to make mortgage payments on these apartments that exist in these ghost cities. Well, that's a big problem that might bring down the entire Chinese financial sector if all these citizens band together and just stop paying their mortgages and just let it rot, as they say. You factor all of that in, and that leads me to believe that President Xi does not want to actually take over the world, because he's got enough problems, internally. And if we bear that in mind, I think that might, calm some tensions and might lead to better decision making here in Washington.
Yeah, I would say even outside of the military context, and it's definitely related. It's kind of easy because we see directly what he says in the tech and cyberspace in terms of their ambitions to be a world leader in tech in multiple ways. Not only to have the technology themselves to employ within China and for their citizens, also to make countries around the world dependent on their tech, whether it's needed for us to manufacture our own technology or if it's deployed in the US. We've seen a number of times where like Chinese-based technology is used in the US. Some we've taken proactive steps to either ban or limit. Others have kind of flown under the radar, like autonomous vehicles that rely on Chinese components are still used in the US. Who knows where that footage is going and how it's being used around sensitive facilities. So that's definitely a concern. And also, I'm very skeptical if China would abide by any best practices or guardrails we set around emerging technologies. Let's take artificial intelligence, for example. As we speak, unless it's been changed, I haven't checked, Senator Schumer should be speaking around what the future of artificial intelligence looks like. So even if we come to 100% agreement in the US around framework for artificial intelligence, I'm not optimistic China is going to follow it. Likewise, if we take a moratorium or a pause on AI, is China going to respect that, or are they going to continue to innovate? I'm not saying we do nothing, we don't have guardrails, because there are questions that are valid around privacy and cyber around some of these technologies, but I have less faith that China cares about those same values that we do. So it is something to weigh, as we move forward in the US, both in the DoD context, as well as just the everyday civilian tech environment.
Before we get to the next excellent question that was submitted by a participant, I wanted to ask, because you all have mentioned other countries, is it smart to be focusing so much on this, the risk that our national securities leaders perceive from China, and is there a downside to focusing so much on that? Are there other risks out there that we should be accounting for as well?
I have many, many thoughts on this. How long do you have? So, I think we are, compared to where we were 10 years ago, when we were focused on the Middle East and just ignoring China, in comparison, right, we're doing a better job of focusing on the real threats these days, I think. But I do think there are some risks, not just in focusing solely on China, but in the way that particularly the Biden administration has framed this problem globally as one of autocracies versus democracies. The idea that we're going to split the world into two blocks, that you're going to have Russia and China and autocracies, and the democracies of the US and Europe and Asia will be on the other side. I think there's a serious risk, not so much even that's not focusing on the wrong threat as much as it's conceptualizing the problem wrongly. I think China and Russia are not the same. They pose very distinct, different threats to the United States, and lumping them together isn't particularly helpful. I think the idea that you're going to build some grand coalition that will oppose all autocracies globally, I think that's a recipe for getting ourselves into a place where we can't find other countries that we can work with on important issues. So I think the problem is less the focus on China and more the fact that we, and this is, I think, natural as Americans, we try to put these things in some grand narrative. But in this context, I'm not convinced the grand narrative is necessarily correct.
Thank you, Emma. Brandon, is China the main cyber security threat? You had mentioned other countries, but are there distinctions that we should be considering?
There are, not to copy Emma. This could be its own webinar probably just on the cyber landscape. So I see China is a very real cyber threat, both what we're actually seeing on a regular daily basis now, and then also where it has the potential to go. But I do think we cannot ignore the cyber threat from other countries, as well as just other groups and individuals. Like we can't even ignore the criminal side of the cyber problem, how a lot of times it is criminal groups, especially behind ransomware commonly. I know it's getting outside the scope a little bit, but I think it's also important for policymakers to really keep that in mind. So we are hyper-focused on bad technology products and applications coming from China, not downplaying them. Let's have that conversation and address them. But there's just as many concerns from applications and technology products from other countries, or other ones that are from China that aren't called TikTok. I'll put it out there. Like I always like to see this is a holistic concern. We have software products, hardware products, applications that all present risks that are made around the world from other nefarious countries. And let me just really drive this home. IoT connected devices. We oftentimes let smart products into our homes. We don't know where they're made or what security precautions are made. If it's by a US company in America, I have a lot more faith. But if it takes a home video camera you're putting in your living room, for example, and it's made by a Chinese company, that's something to be thinking about. And I think those are types of questions that policymakers in DC really need to be thinking about and addressing. I think that's the benefit of certain legislation that's out there right now. Like before other colleagues at R Street critique me for this, I'll share one specific example, is like the Restrict Act. There's concerns with it, especially from like a First Amendment and some constitutional issues. So we'll put them aside for now. But it does take a broader notion that there are other risks from other countries from other types of products. And I think that's important for us to keep in mind.
So real quick, I'm gonna hit on a theme of my work going back many years. I think it's all this discussion, particularly when you talk about being wary about putting smart devices in your home. I think it's important for our civilian and military leaders to think very carefully about how much we kind of, I guess, mortgage our military future on cyber. I'm kind of the school. I'm not exactly a Luddite, but I prefer to call myself a technological pragmatist. So maybe it's not a good idea that every single weapon system that we're buying now touches the net, because if something can be hacked, I promise you that our adversaries have already found ways to do that, or they're actively finding ways to do that as we speak. Those problems aren't, those compromised systems aren't probably going to be known until it's too late. Like after a conflict begins, that's when we're going to find out that the F-35 has been, completely compromised and the fleet is entirely bricked, sitting idle on the tarmac. And so I think that, moving forward, it's important for us to, not just assume that everything that is cyber enabled is better than what came before that isn't cyber enabled. So there's got to be some trade-offs, and I'd like to see a more pragmatic approach moving forward.
Yeah, and I largely agree with Dan. Really, to drive home a point he said is in terms of our weapon systems and being protected, this isn't new. Like the GAO found a report a few years back that over half our weapon systems have vulnerabilities. And because in certain cases, this isn't uniform, but in certain cases, are relying on protection measures that are decades old. Think about even like your smartphone, how much that's changed in the past few years. But we have weapon systems relying on cybersecurity metrics and systems that are decades old. That's really concerning. So definitely agree. And I also agree with the fact that we often like to think of cyber as the answer to everything. And even myself, I catch myself sometimes thinking that. But cyber in isolation has value, but it also has value of like, how does it relate to traditional methods of warfare? Like how can a conventional military unit employ cyber to enhance its capabilities that are non-cyber? So those are the questions I think DoD should be wrestling with, is to really maximize what we have now rather than just trying to reinvent the wheel, it seems like, every day.
We have a question that I think is for Brandon, but if Dan and Emma have thoughts, I do hope you'll chime in. This participant asks, what are some AI and cybersecurity policies that we should be watching out for, both US and China?
So I'll try not to make this too afar, but everybody in DC, regardless if you're a member of Congress or in the White House or you're at a federal agency, and regardless of party, is hyper-focused on AI right now. And there's definitely different extremes on what we can take. On one side, we see calls for a new federal agency that would review the use and prospective uses of AI. You may have to get a license to use AI. There may be audits. There may be outright bans in certain cases. And obviously, I understand why those are being said, but there's also concerns around like, how's that going to harm innovation? How's that going to impact our, competitiveness around the world, as well as our defense posture? So that's one side. The DoD, not to get too in the weeds, is considering their own measures around artificial intelligence, looking at how it can be, and this is a point I like to drive home, there are a lot of positive aspects and applications of artificial intelligence. Taking it back to Dan's last point around weapon systems, AI has the tremendous opportunity to help protect our weapon systems, to detect what is actually a vulnerability and a potential attack against a weapon system versus what's just an anomaly. So I think it is this balance of like, I understand the calls for aggressively regulating, and not saying I'm in that camp by any means, but we can't like lose the benefit to our defense and our security posture and ignore these benefits. And I really hope that's something that DoD is kind of balancing as they go forward. Because I am fearful of a scenario where we just regulate and regulate and regulate. We ban new entries into the markets. The next innovation doesn't come through. Meanwhile, our adversaries in China, they don't care. They're just going to go full steam ahead.
Well, I think this will be the last question because we are running up against a hard noon deadline. And I feel like the more we've talked, the more uncertain everything seems to be, and the more complicating factors there are to this situation. To Brandon's point, we do have to consider the cyber threat. That's not something that's talked about, especially in my budget wonk circles. And to Dan's point, we're often talking about, well, if you want the new toy, then you need to put the old one in the attic, or we're gonna donate it, as my mom would do, or in this case, put it in the desert for a while. But yet there's value in some of those old systems, and the new ones don't work so great or always have a mission. And what Emma has been talking about, traditional warfare thinking isn't necessarily the best or most affordable way to relate or best solution here. So in a resource constrained environment, how do you recommend we weigh and prioritize these risks, where, again, to Emma's earlier point, we don't really know what the end goal is, against rising debt and our own economic stability?
Yeah, no, so thanks again for organizing this. I think it's a great question to end on. I guess let me just say two things. So with resource constraints, I know that family budget metaphors are way overplayed, right? But if your family budget is stretched, you look for places where you can prioritize or save money. One way we can do that is shifting some of the burden to others, trying to encourage European states to carry more of the burden on defense. They are wealthy, they are well placed to do so, right? That is a place where we can prioritize our resources rather than simply continuing to just pay for something because we have for so many years. And then the second point I'll make, and I think I saw Sarah's question in the Q&A, I strongly disagree with this quote that if we spend less on defense, we will fail in some way with regard to China. But I would suggest that actually non-military spending on things like diplomacy and economic statecraft, that is one of those areas where I think if we continue to neglect those spaces, we certainly will not do as well. I think the marginal value of one additional F-35 compared to fully funding the State Department, that is a really bad trade. And so again, prioritization. We should put money where it will do the most good at the margin. And that may not necessarily be military spending. That may not necessarily be something that's in the NDAA. So Dan or Brandon?
Well, I think there is definitely value in a lot of the legacy systems, and I think moving forward, it's important to recognize that the smart people in Washington often get the next war wrong in their predictions. So for, throughout the entire Cold War, everything was focused on, fighting a war against the Soviet Union in the Fulda Gap. And that never happened. But we did fight wars, dirty wars in Korea, in Vietnam, then we fought in the desert, 91, and then Iraq and Afghanistan, obviously, during the war on terror. And we had to do that with a military that, with equipment that wasn't necessarily well suited for that. And we had to scramble a lot, to try to adapt. So I think it's, I'm concerned that the singular focus on China is going to leave us unprepared for, the actual war that we end up fighting next. Particularly, the Marine Corps is, trading huge force structure for this very narrow China scenario, and greatly reducing its flexibility, to meet, potential future challenges. And for all the talk about AI and hypersonics and all those kind of things, warfare hasn't actually changed all that much throughout recorded human history. Because it almost always boils down to young people fighting other young people in close proximity. Like right now, as we speak, there are Ukrainian soldiers in trenches fighting Russian soldiers, within 200 meters. So, it's important for us to remember that and not go so far down the high tech rabbit hole, because that might leave our future teenagers that have to fight the next war, grossly unprepared to meet those challenges.
Yeah, and just being mindful of time, I'll just share a couple quick points. I do think there's a lot of no cost or zero cost, or low cost, I should say, options that DoD should be thinking of in the cyber world. Obviously, the cyber workforce continues to be a challenge. So it's one thing if we go out and invest and buy all these new cool cyber products, but if we are struggling with the people to actually implement them, that's a big issue. And even at its core level, there's not consistency across the branches on how we recruit, how we retain, and how we identify cyber talent and train them. Like, there's basics that we can be doing, we should be doing. Not saying DoD and Congress isn't working toward the direction, definitely room to go, as well as just looking, what are some non-military solutions? Like, I want DoD to continue to innovate. There are fantastic commercial sector opportunities and partnerships. The DoD has been trying to leverage those, but there's still a lot of room to go to kind of cut through the bureaucracy and those other mechanisms that prevent or make it hard for small businesses to do work with the DoD. So, and many of them are phenomenal in the cybersecurity and tech space.
Thank you so much, Brandon and Dan and Emma, for all of your very insightful comments to, again, a very complicated and sensitive subject that we're clearly going to be dealing with for quite some time. I hope that this is a conversation that we can continue in the future. And in the meantime, I urge all of our participants to check out the R Street Institute, Pogo, and the Stimson Center. They all do great work. You can follow Brandon, Dan, and Emma on Twitter as well. That information is on their bio page. They're always putting out great studies and more keen insights into the threats that we all face, whether we're aware of them or not. Thank you again to our speakers and to our participants for joining us today for this important discussion, and have a great afternoon.